Jami Taylor is Vice President for Corporate Affairs at Protagonist Therapeutics, a biopharmaceutical company in California. Previously, she worked for a number of years as a Senior Director for Johnson & Johnson, focusing on their global access policies and more generally on their external relations and worldwide partnerships. She has vast knowledge of the pharmaceutical industry and of the political context in which this industry operates. She has been a great champion for global health within the pharmaceutical industry and beyond, serving among many other roles on the board of directors of Incentives for Global Health, the NGO that is promoting the Health Impact Fund proposal.
It's my intent here to peel back a curtain for you. I know that drug development is often something that is seen as a black box, very difficult to crack into, very difficult to understand. And so know that I'm here as a resource to you as we pursue a discussion to share with you a distillation, at least at the outset here, of why we see the outcomes of the pharmaceutical industry in terms of lopsided development patterns and how we might be able to work together to remedy what is in place at this point in a structural way. So this is a question that's guided my own career, now 22 years within the industry, and it's along the lines of what I just mentioned. Why does private capital flow so heavily into some areas of biomedical R&D, such as oncology, and so little into others, such as neglected diseases? It seems like there might be intuitive answers, but it really takes understanding the R&D process and decision-making with respect to it. So this may be new to some of you, and I hope it's enlightening. It relates to the broad contours of decision-making in drug development, which really comes down to, in its most basic form, two essential criteria that determine whether dollars can be directed at a particular asset, again, in a private pharmaceutical company context. One has to do with the state of the science. Is the science surrounding the particular asset in question sufficient, at least in terms of the data available at that moment, to support forward movement? And many times this relates not just to the state of the science as it pertains to the particular asset, but the broader landscape. Is there enough scientific momentum around a particular area? Is there enough to support a particular thesis to carry scientific progress forward, again, in a particular therapeutic area or asset that represents that therapeutic area? Thinking about IP, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the idea of building out a franchise within a therapeutic area is very important, and that again relates to the state of the science. This baseline criterion by itself often eliminates much of what we see in terms of diseases that disproportionately affect the poor. Then there's this piece that's its own stumbling block as it pertains to much of what we'll talk about today, and that's the aspect of commercial viability. And I'll go into some depth about this. Suffice it to say that commercial viability in the form of not only return on investment, but often outsized return on investment. And again, the possibility of a lengthy commercial win and set of wins pertaining to a franchise that might be built in a particular therapeutic area. This is a foremost concern and often the most difficult to overcome in the context of investment committees, which I'll describe shortly. So of course, these are basic pillars, but there are many considerations that come into play when we think about how discussions around these essential criteria really take place. Specific aspects include that relate to one or both of these pillars include regulatory risk, for example, IP duration in the larger IP environment, willingness to pay, which we'll go into when we think about commercial markets, and market demand and sentiment, market size, and so forth. Now, it's important to understand that as a matter of necessity, the pharma industry takes cues from the external environment. We do not make decisions in isolation. And the major challenge I would suggest that we as an industry face is the fact that fundamentally every decision we make with respect to investment in a particular asset is good versus good. Thinking about the MDR-TB example, which I'm sure we'll talk about in more depth, in that case, we were literally going head to head and very painfully in the J&J context against an investment in a new direction in Alzheimer's research. And these create very challenging decisions for anyone sitting around an investment committee. Along the lines of the external environment and our sensitivity as an industry to the external environment, it's important to understand that policy frameworks that govern our structure and sustainability determine commercial viability of the programs we pursue. And those pieces include regulatory frameworks, which in many ways shape the business model and the required investment to bring an asset to market. And then there are the market exclusivity protections, again, which I'm sure we will discuss, especially as we consider the current context. In addition, of course, and this is something that we could drill down on and talk probably for hours about, we face as an industry the whims, preferences, and punishments of capital markets. If you look at the NASDAQ Biotech Index this week, it has not been a pretty picture as we see a bit of a coming down to earth after the last year. Every ridge in these charts carries with it a great deal of anxiety. There are fortunes made and lost in the context of these charts, and the powers that be that drive this movement have major and even overwhelming influence on the day-to-day decisions and certainly the baseline investment decisions of every pharmaceutical company, small, mid-size, and large. So taken together, all of these factors determine where rewards are placed. And as we think about incentive models, this is important to understand, again, in this fundamental way. I do want to talk about the investment committee context because it's something that is its own sort of hinge point in the journey of any particular asset. It is the context in which battles are waged over good versus good. It is a very difficult place that requires a very strong business case around these investment criteria that I've mentioned and the larger context. It also requires a certain uncanny ability to see into the future and where ambiguities and outsized risks surface. It's an easy no, unfortunately. And this is where, unfortunately, many promising assets with potential application to more complex markets, emerging and frontier markets, this is where they meet their demise, never to see the light of day. And it's in part because this is where trade-offs are exercised. So taking a bit of a deeper dive into opportunity costs, it's important to understand that this is a major barrier to investment in R&D for diseases that disproportionately affect the poor. Every dollar has an opportunity cost associated with it, and it's often perceived as when you're looking at poor commercial viability in a classic sense, it's very difficult to overcome that hurdle as opposed to, say, an oncology drug or a drug for rare disease, where the margins, the win, so to speak, at the end of the day is simply so much higher. That sets aside impact, which I think we can define and should define differently. But unfortunately, these in the investment committee context, opportunity cost decisions are typically made in terms of dollars and cents. You'll see, or I can describe the experience of advocating for Serturo or bedaquiline, the MDR-TB drug brought forward, the first new drug for TB in 40 years, and how that conversation unfolded differently, but certainly very difficult to overcome the opportunity cost challenge. And all of this leads, of course, to market failure, another basic economic context that is present in a certain extreme, I would argue, when we think about access to medicines. And access to medicines, of course, begins with R&D investment decisions. Here you see a simple and straightforward definition of market failure. A quick scan of this, I think, allows for easy applicability to the pharmaceutical context. And after hearing Gary's presentation, I think all of us can appreciate the impact and the realization of market failure as it surfaces and as we can see it. We know, of course, that more than 1 billion people suffer from one or more neglected diseases. This has been a focus, certainly, of my own career, really working to drive R&D into neglected diseases, looking for new models and looking for new opportunities to overcome the hurdles or to apply new lenses and frameworks, new pathways to market. Neglected diseases are, I think, signals in some ways of some of the other products that could easily be brought, or not, maybe not so easily, but that may be in hand or available in what we sometimes in the industry call G7 core markets. But for a number of reasons, we simply don't bring those products as available as they might be elsewhere to some of these more difficult settings. But either way, the health outcomes and the risk to health are particularly high, and we see that evident in all kinds of disturbing points of data, certainly some that Gary has pointed forward today. So a key concept here when we think about those G7 core markets, which drive so much of the R&D investment decisions at the investment committee level, really comes down to willingness to pay, of course, dovetailing with the ability to pay. And that's where you see some of this lopsided market access, market availability come forward. And this is where you see this dysfunction that is very much now present in the political dialogue in the US. The fact that the US pays 3 times more, and in some cases much more than that, for drugs. You can see here a simple look at Humira, an injectable biologic for the treatment of ulcerative colitis, IBD, for example, and the price 96% higher than that even in the UK. How the US pays for innovation, and it acts as its own incentive driver. It also creates this decision-making paradigm and much of what follows from it. Here's yet another sign of an international comparison of drug spending, even with rich countries featured below it. We know from Gary's presentation that not just drug spending per person, but healthcare spending per person in some of the markets we're discussing is far lower, even below $14 per year per person, which creates a devastating sort of environment when we think about the processes and the hurdles to really changing R&D as we know it. And I think Peter Kolchinsky's put it very well when he said this, and it's really very straightforward. Companies have a reasonable expectation that almost any drug that improves on the standard of care, and I would argue even marginally or incrementally, will generate high enough sales in the US to have made the effort worthwhile. And here you see a related phenomenon, and that's the rise of the platform molecule, so to speak, where a single asset receives heavy investment, but it's spliced. I call this hyperorphanization. I know Thomas has written very powerfully about the niche buster phenomenon, and they indeed are one and the same, where this is where an asset that is often known to be able to treat a broad swath of conditions or very prevalent conditions like diabetes, for example, is instead of at its outset indicated for that broad condition, is instead spliced, usually to access the orphan drug path. The Orphan Drug Act of 1983, of course, provided enormous incentives and is more influential than ever at this moment. So what you see is this tiny splicing, which has its own implications for access, I would argue, worldwide, inclusive of G7 core markets, and then the broader world, where an orphan designation is applied, And then a year later, you see usually some patenting activity, as you might imagine, with respect to some aspect of that asset, and alongside it, work with regulatory agencies to expand an indication or win a second indication. Platform molecules are heavily touted among small biotech right now, following what's called the pharmaceutical model, a single asset with 12, 13, 14, 15 indications stacked over time, again, in this very, very narrow tiled sort of way. This all has implications for access, especially as we consider high volume needs and high volume prevalent diseases that need attention in a pressing sort of way. Here's a key concept, returning to global health R&D, and this is important to understand. And this is what I found a concept that's very poorly understood or just unfamiliar to people outside of the pharmaceutical industry. And that's the concept of a dual market opportunity. So my old boss, who's absolutely tremendous and very attuned to global health, Paul Stoffels, will often say, we make our money in the West so we can give away the rest. And in that context, he's often speaking about HIV drugs. You can see the imbalance in terms of ability to pay pictured here. I'm sure this illustration is something familiar to many of you, but there's this sense that capture opportunity in these swelled portions of the world, and then that in turn allows for activity as marginal as it might be, or as late as it might be, relative to initial introduction, later in the process, again, only and participation in worldwide with a particular asset being conditioned on the ability to win a return on investment, and often much more than that in these G7 core markets. An example of this is Mectizan, which is one of the most famous examples of global health magnanimity. In fact, Mectizan, which is its own sort of celebrated case study of pharmaceutical philanthropy, by the time Merck rolled out this philanthropy program to support people living with and suffering from river blindness in frontier markets, Mectizan was already a blockbuster veterinary product, and it already raked in billions for Merck through the course of the 1970s. And that in and of itself allowed for this degree of generosity. Likewise, we saw this, quite starkly in the course of the HIV epidemic with it's 200 billion plus here you see featured in HIV drug sales. That's certainly a dual market opportunity, which allowed, in industry parlance, allowed for participation in PEPFAR, for example, and drug donation programs and support of the Global Fund and so forth. Again, that sort of refrain, we make our money in the West so we can give away the rest. But is that really the model that provides for the best health outcomes worldwide and supports especially work in areas where there is not a clear dual market opportunity? And as I mentioned here, historically in the pharma industry, where there is not a dual market opportunity to be captured, the likelihood of investment in a given disease is particularly low. So with that, I'd like to turn the conversation over to Thomas, who is a brave architect of new models and an advocate for the Health Impact Fund, something I think many of you have studied. I hope it's a point of intrigue. I've been a major proponent of the Health Impact Fund for many years, and that advocacy is something I can certainly talk about. We've together, Thomas and I, and others who work with the Health Impact Fund have been socializing it throughout the industry, particularly over the course of the last 6 months. I do think it's fair to say that the industry is at a crossroad. It is at a very different place, even from a simple mentality perspective, than it was even a year or 2 years ago. This kind of awakening that the pandemic has precipitated, and this push to revamp models, this almost disintegration of orthodoxies and maxims that the industry huddled around in years prior, now gives way to an openness to new models that have the potential over time or even in the near term to support structural change in support of better health outcomes throughout the world. So I'll pause there. Thomas, I'll turn it over to you to introduce the Health Impact Fund, and I'm happy to chime in as you signal.
All right, thanks a million, Jami. And I was wondering whether we should have a few minutes to see whether there are any questions, comments, concerns from the audience before I launch into yet another presentation. Is there anything that you would like to ask Dr. Gottlieb or Jami Taylor?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes. Sure.
Okay, sure. So I've been talking to a lot of different governments, and really the issue with the pandemic now has really become a major issue. The vaccines for Africa hashtag. A lot of countries, I advise some emerging markets, and they feel that they're getting left behind in the distribution because of COVAX. And now you have, COVAX was supposed to be a good thing, and then it's delayed, and then you have AstraZeneca, and then it's just like one thing after another from their perspective. And they feel that they don't want to rely on handouts. And the changing view now in future government funding plans from the first world is that access to vaccines, medications, and PPE will be considered part of critical infrastructure. Russia, for instance, is already offering programs of, we can brownfield your pharmaceutical companies as long as you produce our stuff and we sit on your board. So it has become now part of a geopolitical game, with emerging markets like Latin America and Africa caught in the crossfire for these big world powers using the pandemic. And that's going to translate to an East versus West warfare over access to vaccinations and medications. And they want their own factories. They want their own pharmaceutical plants. They don't want it to be shipped in from the US or Germany or the EU that can block the exports. So I'm interested, so that's where things are, that's the hot issue at the moment. And I'm wondering what your perspective is as experts in the field and being in the pharmaceutical industry, how you see that battle impacting you in the next 12 to 24 months.
So Thomas, should I start to chime in? Gary, please feel free to follow.
Please,
Everything that you've mentioned is absolutely the case. I think especially, I think what's especially chilling may be the fact that this has become a geopolitical game, and even taking off an industry hat and thinking purely in terms of diplomacy, thinking about the success of PEPFAR, for example, as a US diplomacy effort, how readily the US could potentially respond and get ahead of this vaccine distribution challenge, and yet how far behind it seems relative to some of the other players you mentioned, Russia included, and absolutely how caught as other countries feel in this web. But at the same time, the changing, almost hour by hour changing scenario with respect to vaccine status and distribution, the newly emerging safety concerns with respect to AstraZeneca and now Johnson & Johnson has been a shock to the industry, certainly. It's created a huge amount of anxiety in terms of the ability, which was already limited for many of the reasons that Gary described, but the ability to roll out these vaccines at the level that was anticipated prior, even despite a huge amount of behind the scenes work to build the proper infrastructure and so forth. And I can affirm that that work has been underway, building in, for example, new digital tools and new IT systems to support even some of the most remote markets to support vaccination. And so some of these safety concerns have definitely created a wrinkle that may be insurmountable and put us in a position where mRNA vaccines are the sole safe hope, which is its own challenge, especially when we think about distribution, cold chain, supply chain integrity, et cetera. All I can tell you is that the industry doesn't have good answers for this at this moment. And this is what puts the industry in a place, as I mentioned, of openness to new models like never before. I've never seen less confidence, even among some of the large players. A recently released interview in Stat News with the perennially confident CEO of Moderna was interesting in that he cited as a major regret the failure to invest early enough and broadly enough in manufacturing capabilities. And that in and of itself opens up the potential to go well beyond Moderna's suggestion that IP will not be a barrier to access, but also to support manufacturing at scale in a true at scale sense, which means providing the tech transfer, the know-how, the building up of mRNA vaccine production like never before. This is all new for a company that's very, very small, that as of a year ago had no commercial products on the market. So we'll need stakeholders from every corner really rallying around these companies. And I'll just end by saying that we didn't talk about reputation here, but it's increasingly an important metric. In fact, when I think back to the investment committee, where we advocated for forward movement for our MDR-TB asset, which was a very controversial decision for the investment committee and very difficult given the opportunity cost. We won the argument on the basis of reputational gain, but we lost later when stakeholders saw our stumbles in rolling out this product in new markets. We were not attuned to these markets in ways I wish we could have been, but it was a new venture for us as a company, expanding our footprint beyond places we'd been comfortable prior. And as stakeholders took boxing gloves to our faces, which was really how it felt, we faced major internal credibility challenges, those of us who'd advocated for MDR-TB on the basis of reputational gain. And so my message to stakeholders is as easy as it is to criticize the industry, and as instinctive as it is for many of us who see these imbalances as they play themselves out. When I talk about rallying around the industry in this moment, where the industry suggests a willingness to constructively cooperate, to provide any tech transfer in addition to IP waivers and so forth, this is an opportunity to rally, to provide positive reinforcement. And to the extent to which the reputational gain is there, I think you'll see the industry lean in. Where the reputational gain is not clear, we may see a retraction. So that's my point of advice, from someone who's certainly been in the throes of that and knows the dilemma that Moderna faces at this moment, and certainly others, Pfizer and BioNTech included. My hope is that everyone here, as influential as you are, and well beyond this particular seminar, that you'll consider your role in lifting up and encouraging companies to move in the direction of new models and the exercise thereof.
Yeah, just what because their attitude now is, if you want to come and instead of building just water dams, electricity, ports, and roads, build us also pharmaceuticals so that we are not beholden to the exports from Europe or export bans from the US. That's where this is moving to. That's where I see this moving to.
I think so too. And I would say beholden to broken supply chains that can't sustain a cold chain requirement, especially for the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And so I think it's an absolutely beautiful thing that pharmaceutical production capacity is being woven now into critical infrastructure discussions, but it requires that sharing of expertise, especially as we think about more sophisticated technologies, and we'll need cooperation in spades from those who just given standard systems may be less inclined to give it without a positive push.
Could I ask Vanessa to put some meat on the bone of this allegation? Where exactly do we have Soviet-style fab plants moving in? I haven't seen them in South Africa or Brazil.
Well, actually, I'm not sure they're being built in Brazil. They already have a signed agreement in Argentina. They are in discussions in the next stage in Brazil, discussions to open in 60 to 90 days. They have signed an agreement for production in South Africa and also in Serbia.
With China or China
No,
or
Sputnik.
Sputnik?
And as part of their sales offers to countries are, we can sell you the vaccine, but even better is we can brownfield if you have a pharma lab that's, sort of up and running-ish, right? Well, we will invest to get it up to standard as they won't greenfield, but they'll brownfield the project and then help you produce. Now, this has a lot of appeal to a lot of countries who go, listen, if I'm not getting the vaccines, I've got people dying. I've got people dying and I need vaccines. And if I'm not going to get them from the Americans or the Europeans, far be it from me to say no to the Russians or the Chinese. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans are all fighting in this geopolitical battle. And in the middle are the emerging markets with people who are dying. We're like, whoever vaccinates my people wins. And if I can have a development project that generates jobs and I get a foreign investment into a pharma lab, I get reelected. So that's where the other pieces of the puzzle come in. And unfortunately, as ever, the poor are stuck in the middle.